And I'll just make some introductions. So we have Peter Dickinson, and he's a prof here in the English department, and he writes extensively about performance. And we have Lennox Johnston-Yu, who's a Vancouver youth, who is interested in reading, performing, and she also writes and illustrates her own books. And we also have Nermin, I'm going to ask you how to say the last name. Gogalic, who is a writer from Rijeka who's particularly interested in the industrial heritage of the city. So we'll hear from Peter, Lennox, and Nermin in that order.
Okay, so thank you very much. Althea, it's true, you need to see this on a big screen. It's so different from when watching it on my computer. So thank you very much, and thank you to Maiko for inviting me to make some remarks, which are just very preliminary responses coming from my perspective as a performance studies person and an academic, so forgive the egg-headedness in parts. But I think just to begin, it's really interesting to be watching the film in this space. Woodward's, the former site of an important anchor to the local economy here, and to think about the ghosted labor in the cultural work that's being done in this space. As with Althea's previous work in this area, I'm thinking in particular of her site-specific Carroll Street project. We have, I think, a kind of link to the film we have just seen, a bold and forceful critique of dominant discourses of creative placemaking, because there are more than one out there in which art and creativity are often wholly subsumed by the logic of financialization that persists in measuring their public worth solely in terms on a return on investment. So the plan to turn the factory into a multiplex cultural hub with a hotel to attract presumably tourist dollars. Excuse me. Instead, by having the children occupy the factory, and through their very playful theatrical and choreographic explorations, we have the artisanal skills that are required to sustain the life side of the art-life binary brought to the foreground here. So what I'm sort of thinking about there is that in especially the choreography, we see the work that's the physical labor in the factory approaching the virtuosity of ballet. Which I think is a pretty amazing thing to bring out. And in this respect, we see a kind of another version of creativity being marshaled here, and especially one that's a system of public coordination. So the coordination that needs to go into an assembly line, for example, as well as the coordination that needs to go into a corps de ballet. And I'm going to come back to dance in just a bit. And Maiko, can you give me a signal when I'm approaching 10 minutes, because I don't want to go on. When watching the work of children, in the context of an industrial factory, you can't help but think of the history of child labor a little bit, and I'm sure that's being referenced here. And the Fordist model of industrialization, if we inaugurate that, although I think there's some debate here in the 19th century, then you can't help but think about how children were part of that, and in fact, the main layer of that workforce. But also, we think of children here, and Lennox can perhaps speak to this better than I can. But if you think of children as kind of an emblem of futurity, these children they don't have that legacy to inherit, right? So they're born into a post-Fordist society, born into an economy largely a service economy that's dependent on immaterial labor, the layer that we don't quote-unquote see, that's primarily effective. And so how are we bringing these two histories together? I think there's some really interesting things that are happening in terms of temporalities that I'll come back to maybe. But I'd just like to also say that I think this is a wonderful tradition that is being continued here at the Push Festival in terms of honoring the voices of children in performance. So Althea's film joins a tradition in which we can place Darren O'Donnell and mammalian diving reflexes work, Haircuts by Children, the Gastown Restaurant Reviews, as well as an important work that was performed by Theatre Replacement, That Night Follows Day, in 2009, the work based on Tim Etchell's. And in these performances, we see children pointing out to us some of the most obvious but no less profound truths, as when, for example, that wonderful scene where the children, I'm presuming, based on some of your prompts, Althea, talking about what's work, what's art, what's play. And the one girl says, when we open our mouths to speak, that's work. And it's true. I mean, the physical labor of just interacting on a daily basis is something to honor. But I also like the fact that they're savvy enough to know that when the camera's rolling, it's work. When they're alone playing, presumably in the factory, it is play to a certain extent, and it's art. So just because my work is focusing on dance these days, I just was struck by the choreographic score in the film. And so to reference an earlier point I was making, in having the children not so much overtly pantomime as sort of abstract a sequence of gestures and movement phrases, the daily choreography enacted by factory workers as they go about their assigned jobs, we get a sense of the artistry, the virtuosity required to do a job well. We also, I think, in turn, have exposed to us something we often take for granted and don't acknowledge: the physical labor that goes into movement making, into dance. Dance, especially ballet, is supposed to appear effortless, and yet it requires a daily regimen of practice, and it's kind of that routinized body at the bar that's really interesting to me to put beside the laborer at the workstation, and that was something that really struck me as quite interesting. And so, just to reference that sequence where the brother and sister, the boy-girl exchange, are describing the movement, that seems really important to me, because in naming it, it becomes material, and we see the effort that's going into making that movement. And just on another note, the dancers in the room know this. To be a dancer is so precarious, not just in terms of the physical risk, the risk of injury on the job that makes another association with manual labor in a factory, but also because it's among the performing arts professions in Canada the lowest paid. And so there's that precarity, that financial precarity that's brought out as well. And just the last thing I'll say before I pass the microphone on to Lennox is that I'm struck by the concept of reenactment. And I know that Althea has explored this before in the work that preceded this one, the restaging of Peter Weiss's Marat Sade, which was just last year, wasn't it? You're so prolific. It's amazing. But reenactment's a big thing in my discipline right now. We're obsessed by it, especially with performance art as it gets reenacted in museums, reenacted and commodified in museums. Thank you, Marina Abramovic. Thank you, James Franco. Oh my God. And I think in this film, we're witnessing a different kind of reenactment through gesture and speech, a history of physical labor that these children were not alive to see, and that they likely only have access to through these source texts or through the memories of their parents or their grandparents. And so we have a kind of copy without an original. And authenticity in this respect is not the key. It's not like the Civil War reenactors who want to get it right. Instead, the children are exposing what theorist Rebecca Schneider calls the theatricality of time, in which the children's present-day repetition of what past activities and conversations they think took place in the factory, in which that space, past and present, are made to touch. And it's a kind of theory Schneider, referencing Gertrude Stein's, calls it temporal syncopation. We're able to rematerialize and give value to the laboring bodies otherwise occluded by neoliberalism, and I would add, as a performance studies person, a history of anti-theatricalism. And just to make this, I know that was like, woo, where did we go there? Just to reference a scene where the children are wondering whether they're working or playing or making art in this space, in this time space where past and present touch. Workers can be artists and artists can be workers. Thanks very much.
I feel so bad I didn't. I feel so bad that I didn't. Well, you got all that stuff and I got this.
That's all right.
Yeah. Okay, first, I definitely think that this should be in public theaters. That's, yeah. At one point, I wasn't sure whether it was a documentary or, like, say, a movie. And I guess it's a little bit of both. But sometimes it seems like it's a documentary, and sometimes it seems like it's a movie. So it's kind of a mixed bag in that way. I think casting all kids was a big part of this film, because mostly adults are cast, and I don't think it gets the message across in the same way. I think what's different is kids don't often get to speak, and when they do get a chance, then it comes across powerful, because everyone knows this might be the last chance that you get. When the kids are fixing up Bencic, they're using invisible tools. And I think that shows imagination. And I think that is also an important part of this film, because if there wasn't any imagination here, I don't think anybody would be here tonight. When the kids are talking about their jobs as workers, you can see that they really looked into that. They really decided, this is who I'm going to be, and this is who I was, and this is what I'm going to say. It's interesting that It's interesting that they give their ages at the beginning. They say I'm 26, I'm 41, and they replicate that level of age in a certain way that gives off an air that they're still young, but they're doing a job that older people can do. I'm just gonna flip this. I think some of the best parts is when they say words and it takes you a second to figure out what they actually said. Like when they have to sound out the words and the meanings. Like when the three boys were reading the book and the one just kept asking, what's that? What's this? It gives you an idea how they haven't been educated, but at the same time, they have a lot of knowledge. Near the end, where they're arguing with the mayors, They're persistent and stubborn, and the mayors, they say, we have the power and we can kick you out. That's true, but the workers, they have willpower, which it sometimes can be greater than just power. And at the very end, when they're talking about their dreams, when the girl is saying she worked at the factory and then she went out and she saw it snowing in the springtime, it makes you wonder, what does that dream mean? What's the true meaning of all the nonsense? And one last thing. Just kind of loop back to the beginning. Honestly, best idea ever to cast kids. Okay, never forget that.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I would like to thank Althea for giving me a chance to speak here, and I would like to use that chance to try and give a more of a local perspective on this movie. Well, the movie is obviously about a factory, but it's at the same time a story about our city. And what Althea does, she, through a number of historical references, gives us a walk through Rijeka's history. The example, in example, she's using the Fuman dialect, the dialect that was created on the streets of our city under a strong influence of Slavic, Austrian, and Italian language. And in that way, she tells the story of the 19th century Rijeka, a very important industrial Central European city with its many factories and a very diverse ethnic structure. It's important to say that all of these different nationalities and cultures are, for the greater part of that century, given a privilege to freely practice their customs, their cultural and their religious customs. Further on, there is a mention of the fascist Rijeka, the Rijeka of 20s and the Rijeka of 30s of the 19th century. At the time, the ethnic structure of the city changes in favor of the Italians, thus strengthening their cultural influence. And finally, there's this Rijeka of post-World War II, the Rijeka of socialist Yugoslavia, whose ethnic structure changes a lot because the Italian population unfortunately flees the city during World War II, and in their place a number of different nationalities from this new Yugoslavia, a number of South Slavic nationalities are strategically inhabited. It's hard to talk about Rijeka's history and not to mention two really short episodes, both dating to the end of World War I. And in this post-war turmoil, the city is first occupied by Gabriele D'Annunzio, an Italian poet who governs the city on a newly written constitution that is a very queer combination of proto-fascist, anarcho-syndicalist, socialist, and democratic ideas. And the co-author of this constitution is the famous Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, the father of Italian futurism. After that episode, Rijeka is proclaimed as a sovereign, independent state. And not only is it proclaimed like an independent state, it is also internationally recognized, and it is a member of, becomes the member of the League of Nations, the equivalent of today's UN. It is important to say that during all this time, the industry is fundamental for the city's growth, and it's also fundamental for the shape of our city's identity. But this movie is also more importantly about the present-day Rijeka, and I believe that the greater part of the movie can be read as a straightforward critique of the local political establishment, establishment, of its inability to transform Rijeka into a modern post-industrial city, and of its incompetence to build on this immense potential of post-industrial Rijeka. In one point in the movie, we have a chance to read a really important sentence, and that sentence goes somewhere in the lines of, the workers of Richard Bencic have been laid off in waves due to different reasons, including ethnic eligibility. And this turns our attention to the unfortunate events of the early 90s. At that time, a civil war breaks out in our region. And at that point, Croatia is already going through a right-wing revolution led by Croatian Democratic Union, ultra-nationalistic right-wing party. What happens there is that through propaganda and by the means of mass media, an atmosphere of fear is created and an enemy is identified. That enemy is, of course, the Serbian minority in our country. And not long after that, hostilities towards this Serbian minority start to occur all around the country. And while these atrocities and hostilities are far greater in the rest of Croatia, it has to be said that even in a multinational and tolerant Rijeka, the members of Serbian minority are threatened, intimidated, their jobs are taken away from them, and in that way they are pushed into exile and emigration. Unfortunately, these events and still until today are very much a taboo subject in our community. And it's not something that you would like to discuss in a bar or a restaurant, but more likely in a privacy of your home. So this process of radicalization of political discourse and radicalization of public opinion that starts in the beginning of 90s shapes Croatian society in a very conservative and in a way a xenophobic society that it is today. Well. Our city, 10 years after the independence of Croatia, is unfortunately stricken of its industry. The industry has been systematically destroyed, and the ethnic structure of the city changes. It becomes more uniformed. The city stricken of its industry and of this tolerant atmosphere that it always had goes through a period that goes into a deep crisis of identity. The people who are in charge of our city decided that they are going to change course and that they are going to try to develop Rijeka into a cultural capital for the region. They start this process with branding. And unfortunately, more or less, that's the only thing that happens because their cultural policy shows to be completely wrong. They are unable to construct a cultural platform from beneath, much due to the lack of funding and support for the independent scene. Well, through all this time, the last 15 years, this process of branding the city as a city of culture and tolerance is ongoing. And what it actually does for our city, in a way, it changes what used to be our city's identity, and it transforms it in a mere image, nothing more than that. All of the projects, the cultural projects in the city are stopped, and we are in a position of status quo for 15 years now. I believe that the future of the city will very much depend on what is going to happen to this industrial heritage, and in what way we are going to be able to revive this multicultural and tolerant atmosphere that we were so much proud of. And finally, I consider this project to be a contribution to that better, more tolerant Rijeka of the future, the Rijeka that we are all hoping for. That's all.
I just wanted to really thank the panelists. That was such a diverse range of responses. So thank you, Peter, so much. And Lennox, thank you for bringing the child's perspective, which is a really powerful voice inside the film. And thank you, Nermin, for bringing that really local perspective, too. So on behalf of Theatre Replacement, the Push Festival, and Institute for the Humanities, I just want to thank Althea Thauberger for her film and for her work. And I also wanted to mention that Theatre Replacement has this series called Screen Time, of which this film is a part. And we do it about 3 or 4 times a year. And it's just a chance for us to screen performance on film and then have a discussion. So we often followed up with a panel response. So we'd love for you guys to come to that because we're meeting some new faces here. And Sarah Moore, the lovely Sarah Moore, will be standing up near the top. If you'd like to be informed about those events, please sign up. The next film we have is a kind of bizarre and wonderful Japanese performance called The Room Nobody Knows that's touring around right now. Yeah, so check in with Sarah if you'd like to know more about that. So once again, thank you so much to Althea. Thank you to the panelists. And will we be seeing this film again, Althea, at some point? Is it screening in Montreal right now, I heard? That's finished. It will be around again, I'm sure of it. And, you know, I've seen the film now, I think, three or 4 times I've watched it on different various screen sizes. And I have to agree with you, Peter, it's amazing to watch it in this cinema. And certainly this panel response and hearing you talk about it again has deepened my appreciation for it even more. So thank you so much for that. And thanks, everybody, for coming.